All right, we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our today's webinar. And our today's webinar speaker is Aaron Scantlin from NERSC Security. He's a security engineer here at NERSC, and he's going to present on how Zeek helps secure open science. So welcome, Aaron, and take it away.
Howdy. Hello, everyone. As Fatima said, I'm Aaron Scantlin. Very happy to get to share with everyone how Zeek is critical to helping NERSC maintain an acceptable balance between upholding our mission of supporting open science and necessarily ensuring security. So I've got an agenda up here. I'm a security guy by trade, so by all means, I know this is being recorded. If you're busy, right? But after this, I'll very quickly, introduce myself. Next, I'll explain, I guess, NERSC as well, briefly. But I'll talk about NERSC's mission within the Department of Energy, as well as talk a bit about open science. Specifically what it is, as well as some of the more prominent embodiments of it at NERSC, at least as far as I see them. From there, we'll go ahead and discuss some of the more relevant aspects of how Zeek helps us fulfill our mission. And then we will take a look at NERSC's Zeek cluster architecture at a high level. We'll drill down a little bit into each of the core components of that architecture as well. Cover two of the more important functions that our Zeek cluster facilitates, automated blocking and what I like to call SIEM on a stick for certain log formats, in particular SSH, a couple others as well, but don't want to ruin the surprise. And then I'll briefly touch on our maintenance and feature inclusion processes, as well as some planned future work. And then finally, if we've got some time left, I'll go ahead and put on the blindfold, stand up straight so y'all can put me to the test. All right, I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, but I always tell folks never to listen to anybody who ain't got any business speaking about what they're telling you. This slide is really just intended to illustrate that this ain't my first rodeo. I've been around the block once or twice. Does that mean I know everything? Heck no. If you hear me say something that you think is wrong, whack, whatever, or you're just not sure, right? You want to hear more about it. Say something in the chat. Trying to keep a good eye on the chat as well. Hopefully that's okay. I don't know if that's allowed during these webinars, but we're breaking rules. I'm making my own rules. Like I said, I am a security guy by trade, but I will mention briefly that one of the cool things about Zeek is that it can be useful to data scientists as well as security practitioners. It's always really cool whenever somebody else at NERSC who's not on the infrastructure side of things, says, "Hey, can you help me answer, this, that, or the other question?" And it's like, oh, yeah, actually, with a little bit of work, we can. So that's always neat. Now, a large part of why I am here today is thanks to my employer, NERSC. So we are the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. But if I might gush for just a second, easily one of the coolest places I've had the opportunity to work. I am very passionate about transparency and the idea that knowledge should be free, at least in my opinion, when and where possible. NERSC is pretty unique among the DOE sites in a lot of ways, but perhaps my favorite being the requirement for research that happens here to be published. As such, a lot of different types of sensitive data, HIPAA, CUI, classified, all that jazz, not permitted on NERSC resources. When one hears the term national lab, I know at least before I worked here, my mind immediately went to like Los Alamos, right? One of the boom boom labs, I like to call them. But NERSC's overall risk appetite more resembles that of a Research One university than really anything else, if you ask me. So something to keep in mind, as we continue on through this talk. I think that's pretty awesome, personally, right? I've got a definition of open science here from science.gov. But again, if you think of NERSC as kind of this super powered, R1 school, seeing something like Jupyter, here on this slide is probably not a huge surprise. NERSC allows its users to configure and deploy Jupyter instances using a self-service model. And as is the case with just about any, non-trivial software package, one does have to take some care in order to utilize that thing appropriately or securely, I suppose, would be the more correct word. Research computing sysadmins are kind of tasked with this somewhat impossible task, joke, not a joke, finding that ideal balance between, security controls and allowing researchers the freedom to, I guess, shoot oneself in one's foot, for lack of a better term, really, if we're being honest. There's a couple other things on this slide as well. So Spin is the name that NERSC has given to its Kubernetes cluster. We allow users to, spin up pods, see where the name came from, and interact with, data on other NERSC systems, showcase their work, really anything else that their minds can come up with. Understandably, we've got to put a few more guardrails on this compared to something like Jupyter, but we still keep this as open and customizable as possible. One of the more recent ways that NERSC has tried to democratize science is through something called the Fair Universe Project. This involves folks submitting codes to be run on NERSC systems from outside NERSC. They have to be vetted first. Admittedly, Zeek doesn't help terribly much in that respect, but it does exemplify open science. So enough about all that, right? There's a lot of products that aim to do what Zeek does, or make what Zeek does easier. And I haven't tried them all by any means. I can tell you that a number of them just use Zeek under the hood. And I'm not talking about Corelight for what it's worth. Corelight is awesome. And if people power is something you're strapped with, go for it, right? But if you've got a curious mind and some time to tinker, I am here to tell you how much fun Zeek can be. I've got a number of the major reasons why NERSC is stuck with Zeek shown here. The only aspect of observability that I'll really, belabor upon here is that Zeek has over some products, excuse me, is that your sensors are separate from Zeek. So instead of like with a different product, maybe you've got to pay for some potentially expensive SaaS or hardware, appliance that some company wants to tack on your invoice or whatever, you're just relying on network taps with Zeek, or you're relying on the existing capabilities of your networking infrastructure in lieu of tap. Coffee there. So Zeek can scale up with network bandwidth and does so pretty easily when operating in a cluster configuration. I'm not going to talk about cluster setup in this talk. If running it in a clustered setup is something you are curious about but haven't really explored, don't know where to start, shouts out to Eric Ui's Zeek Security Zen series. Amazing tutorial that I would highly recommend anyone take a look at. But essentially you'll spec out your node based on your desired blend of rack density, processing power, and your bandwidth monitoring needs. Now, without a doubt, probably the biggest advantage of Zeek is its, at least in my eyes, is its native scripting language, letting you, act on virtually any network event Zeek observes, right? Zeek can go from packet analysis framework to active security monitoring, and in fact, intrusion prevention in some respects. We're definitely in detection, sometimes prevention, right? Kind of depends on the particular thing we're talking about. With just a few Zeek packages and a little bit of script development. If you are lucky, and you happen to run, a particular networking hardware stack, might just be a few Zeek packages and an API key. Things like Dumno are available that have been developed by folks over the years. Dumno in particular lets you interact with Arista devices and shunt elephant flows via the Arista API. So super handy stuff to speed along development. And there's others out there as well, but it's a big one. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't call out, the awesome community surrounding Zeek, the developers, the leadership team, even Vern Paxton himself, which, I'm one of those nerds, right? I get starstruck whenever I see, like big developer names and stuff. It's really cool to see a creator of something still contributing to the community, responding to messages in the Slack, responding to forum posts. That's just awesome. Lots of product lines have some kind of community tied to them, sure, but it's oftentimes out of necessity or shared trauma, if you will. My point is that having an organic community that actually cares about the software as well as how it can be leveraged is something that I find immensely refreshing compared to other communities that I've been in or spent time with, I should say. Okay, enough chitter chatter, right? Let's get into the weeds just a little bit more here. Let me first apologize for this diagram. It could be a little bit clearer, but I also wanted to make sure it was readable. So let me explain it though. Hopefully it's not too unintelligible. So our ISP, ESNet, is represented there on the left, and they provide two uplinks for us. We've got a 400 gig network and a 100 gig network. The 400 gig network is the set of, the lines that are 4 times as thick as the other set of lines. You'll notice I didn't put those thick lines in between the routers. They're there, all right. It's just I wanted to try and make this diagram a little bit more clean, right? So pretend like all those, arrows are there, but know that that 100 gig network and that 400 gig network are, supported. Technically, the 400 gig is the production network. The 100 gig network is sort of a test bed nowadays. Anyway, those green circles that you see up there represent where we've placed our network taps. And if you're asking yourself, hey, are they tapping outside the border router, or is that just, that bad diagram Aaron was alluding to? No, we're tapping outside the border. The answer to that question is yes. If you are wondering if we see a lot of garbage there, the answer is also yes. That is a fun place to tap for research purposes, but not going to lie, folks, generally doesn't contain a lot of actionable intelligence. Most folks don't have a reason to tap outside the border. Roughly 85 to 90% of the traffic that we see is rejected, thanks in part to Zeek. Contained within that middle box is tended to represent NERSC's network. And obviously, we are missing a lot of granularity here, right? But what's important for our purposes is shown in the box on the right. We've got a small subnet that is protected by a core firewall. Despite, supporting open science, we've still got critical infrastructure to protect. So yeah, we've got a firewall. But yep, we've got that subnet there on the right. So the network taps all connect to a series of packet brokers that are protected by this firewall. The management link is separate. I didn't want to confuse things even more, but I assure you we can access that packet broker. But I'll talk more in detail about it a little bit later. But essentially, if you're not familiar, it takes the raw fire hose of tap traffic and sends it along to the Zeek cluster. Zeek's going to analyze that traffic, and when appropriate, it's going to send a block request over to our RTBH server. I'll talk about when Zeek finds that appropriate here in just a little while. And finally, when we do need to block something, that RTBH server is going to use BGP to propagate that block out to our border routers and effectively stop the threat in its tracks. Again, depends on precisely what sort of activity we're talking about. It's not necessarily going to immediately cease every threat, but, if we're thinking about the real basic stuff, your port scanners and whatnot, nips that stuff in the bud real quick. Let's take a look at each of these components a little bit closer anyway. So nothing really terribly fancy about our tapping infrastructure, the taps themselves. I've included this here just in case, there's anyone watching this that, hasn't messed with clustered operation of Zeek before, isn't really sure, how to do it. I'm giving you a little bit of a shopping list, a little cheat code for a huge network. You don't have to go this hard, I assure you. We've got a mix of 50-50 and 70-30 split taps. But, again, they're not smart, right? Which is great. I won't get on that soapbox, but we're just, passively splitting light here. Certain runs we do 70-30 for, but yeah, either 50-50 or 70-30. The PBs are the packet brokers. That is not peanut butter, but they sure are important in making the whole setup stick together. Bad jokes, everyone. Get your groans out. Okay, we can move on. One of the problems with complex tapping infrastructure, or at least, a high bandwidth, I guess, tapping infrastructure, is that you are likely going to get duplicate packets. So again, think about where all those tapping points are back there. We're going to see, copies of things. This problem gets further compounded the more saturated and high bandwidth your network gets, more packets, more duplications, among other things, right? The packet brokers are going to take that traffic as input, clean it up, and pass it along to the Zeek cluster. Now, something worth mentioning here, in my opinion, as far as architecture is concerned, is take the time, or at least try to, right? Unanticipated growth can throw all of this, proper planning out of the water. But do try to take the time to consider what's your network going to look like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. The size and capability of the packet brokers that you wind up purchasing, today, if you're just starting your cluster endeavor, is going to influence how easily, yeah, I guess easily is a fair word, that you're going to be able to scale up with growth. Laziest example, if you buy the absolute smallest packet broker you could, afford to run in your data center now, growth is going to, make things more painful than they need to be. You could have grown more quickly and or more easily if you had ponied up and thought about the future a little bit more. Next, we've got our Zeek nodes. Now, building out a Zeek node is never looks the same, right? It all depends on what network am I monitoring, what are the considerations of what I want to look for there. Here at NERSC, we want to see everything, right? So we need some pretty beefy systems. Our pipes are not fully saturated all the time, but they do see full saturation. So we have a series of nodes that, and there's, for example, one thing I didn't list in here is the monitoring NIC, or excuse me, the management NIC. The monitoring NIC is in there. But those are the important pieces, right? The Epic 7402P was at the time the best bang for buck, essentially. Sure, you could get something with high core density, and if you are off the cuff, let's see, if you are constrained for space in your data center, right? Maybe that is a core pun not intended, but I'm taking it. Maybe that is a core consideration that you need to make, right? But essentially, you want to find where am I going to get the best bang for my buck on CPU. What CPU you choose is going to determine how many workers you can run on a given node. How many workers you can run is going to determine your RAM ceiling, or at least your theoretical RAM ceiling. Memory leak problems can be real, so gotta get to the bottom of those in order for you to find that true ceiling. But plenty of RAM is definitely something to consider. Memory profiling is something that one can do, I guess, leading up to pricing out a cluster, of course. We've got 1 terabyte RAID 1 disk space on all of our nodes. You don't necessarily need to do that for all nodes, but this has a side benefit of allowing us to, in the event of a hardware failure, say, arbitrarily, replace one node, with another, even if that node happened to be the primary node of the cluster. A lot easier if it's just workers, but and then the Mellanox XConnect 5 card is what we've selected for our monitoring NIC. Those have been rock solid, I gotta say, with the Mellanox drivers. Those have been primo. The packet loss that we see is due to elephant flows that don't get shunted for one reason or another. They are working fantastically. And then we've got our remote triggered black hole server. Nothing super crazy about this. We've got just a standalone system that's running an SQLite database and BGPD. We have a low watermark and a high watermark. We don't need to know exact numbers right now, I don't think. But basically, once we get to that high watermark, we unblock a bunch of IPs such that we are back down to the low watermark, and we do that in a way that the oldest IPs are unblocked first. So I've called it a delayed catch and release here. Future work is to leverage the brokers or net control frameworks, native methods of doing that, but baby steps. All right, couple pieces of functionality. Oh, heavens, gone very quickly. The firing squad is not going to be fun. Maybe it will, who knows? Automated blocking. So a lot of folks are doing this, but I'm not 100% sure how many folks are aware of ScanNG. So, uh, Bro Simple Scan is the name of the Zeek package that has been the recommended default for scan detection for, gosh, some time now. Um, but what I don't see a lot of chatter about is ScanNG. If you go, search for ScanNG in a Google browser, you will find a slightly dated repo. I think Ashish made an update in the past year or maybe a year ago. But this is something that I've been focusing a lot of my efforts on as of late, and ensuring that it is up to snuff, at least for NERSC's use, as well as Zeek 7, which is good to go. Just there's some cleanup I would like to do to make things, I guess, easier for maybe a newbie to try and dip their toes in. But this is it is like Bro Simple Scan on steroids. It is so Bro Simple Scan is only TCP aware, at least out of the box. But ScanNG is UDP and ICMP aware as well. Now, this is a double-edged sword. All right. So when you start considering UDP as a potential source for scan activity, that it can bite you if you have sources of UDP traffic that are legitimate that you weren't aware of. But furthermore, you're talking about using a lot more cycles at that point, because there's when there's UDP packets involved, they tend to fly, right? So this is a tread with caution kind of thing. But if you really want to put rocket boots on your automated blocking procedures, let's wrap a little bit. And I hope to do a future webinar to discuss this more in depth. But again, just kind of teasing things out for everyone. And my first talk with the Zeek folks, so I'm feeling y'all out as well. We do look for more things than what is just on here in this blue box, but these are the things that we are blocking on, the things that we look for to block on, I should say. I guess whether we block on them or not, admittedly, does depend on which Zeek cluster we're talking about. But yeah, port address and random scans should all look rather familiar to folks that are familiar with Bro Simple Scan. And I'm going to make the assumption that folks in here are. If you're not, ping me in the Slack afterward, and I will definitely talk to you about that. Landmine might be one that folks haven't seen. That's defined in ScanNG. It is effectively like a darknet trigger. So if you're familiar with the companion script to Bro Simple Scan, Bro is darknet. Or I guess I say companion, complementary might be the better term. That will let you, define areas of your network that shouldn't be accessed under, any circumstances because they are not assigned IPs. And as such, the theory being that, well, anyone poking around there, we can probably block them. Maybe don't block them on the first try. It could just be an errant ping or something like that. But you set yourself a threshold. And, well, if you try to talk to too many darknet IPs, then, I guess darknet in the Bro package sense, not in the dark web sense or anything. Backscatter traffic, if you've got denial of service attacks being launched, I guess, against other entities taking advantage of your resources, or for that matter, you are being, slapped with backscatter traffic from DDoSes or anything else. This will aim to detect that. Again, that gets pretty cycle heavy, so do enable with caution. Low port trolling, looking for attempted connections to low, and low is usually sensitive ports. You define which ones you're interested in and whatnot. We do still look for URIs for reasons unknown to me. Lots of bots still like to fire out HTTP requests, so we can see the script kiddies trying to poke at WP login or whatever the hot new web shell that week is. Of course, most traffic is TLS encrypted now, and we do not have a bump in the wire. So we can look at SNIs for interesting information. User agents, if a known malicious user agent string is observed, that's not one you see as much anymore. But again, you can catch the real, bottom of the barrel stuff. And Log4j is still alive and well every so often. We don't see it nearly as much as we used to when it came out, but still alive. All right, this is the part that is perhaps the most interesting to folks because I don't know of anyone else doing this. And I think it's pretty cool. Now I will caveat this with I had no part in this other than the Zeek conversion work. This was operating in Bro already. But something kind of cool that we do at NERSC in order to keep tabs on folks is, I guess it's much more. What's the word I'm looking for here? We essentially keystroke SSH, right? This is no secret. If you take a look at our terms of use, no expectation of privacy, and we've talked about this in a number of talks over the years. But long story short, we use an instrumented version of SSH in order to track what users are doing on our systems. For the most common access method. Of course, SSH is not the only way that NERSC systems are accessed nowadays. But still, I think it's 65% or so, I think was a stat that I heard leadership mention a couple of weeks ago. Don't quote me on that precisely, but a majority, shall we say. So we actually we call it instrumented SSHD, so because we're taking SSHD and instrumenting it with our own code. Right. It's based on HPN SSH. So HPN SSH, for those of you unfamiliar, high performance networking SSH. It is a fork of Open SSH that research computing is fond of. We are anyway, and a number of other facilities are as well. We combine that with fluentd, which is a log, I guess, aggregation and ship. Think of it as a Logstash-ish, sort of thing. Just that's kind of an unfair, call, but conceptually speaking, it flies. Again, pun intended with the bird logo for fluentd. And so what we do is, for any host that we want to instrument this for, so this would be our login nodes. Login nodes are the large bulk of the systems that have SSH monitored, but any system in which we expect end users to be SSHing into. We will install ISSHD, obviously, and the Fluent daemon, and we will configure fluentd to send logs to a different Zeek cluster, not the same Zeek cluster that's monitoring our edge network or anything, but a separate Zeek cluster. And that Zeek cluster is also, going to be running fluentd. It's got to be able to listen, right? And we're going to configure Zeek to, basically pull where the logs are thrown by fluentd. And sorry, I did skip a little part. Fluentd is being used to massage the logs into a format that Zeek expects. I say expect, we're telling it what to expect. But essentially we are, using this as a steam on a stick. We are shimming our SSH logs as well as, like I mentioned before, a couple other log types into a Zeek worker process and using it as, the poor person's SIEM. I say poor person's, it's for a small enough set of logs or a set of logs that you want to keep private enough, and reduce the complexity of where they get passed to. It's certainly an interesting option. From it, we get easily searchable SSH logs, just like we do any other Zeek log, right? It's super rad. I will be more than happy to talk in more depth about that with anyone that's interested, maybe offline, or in the Q&A, sure. Or down the road for that matter. We do, of course, have regular maintenance and features added in. So we are very blessed to have separate dev and prod clusters for all of the Zeek clusters that we operate. Essentially, when someone gets an idea about, oh, hey, we could do this really neat thing with Zeek, we'll go ahead and sort of craft up a proof of concept, do maybe some local testing, or maybe do some testing straight on the dev cluster. But once things look, kind of promising, we'll get that into Git, and then we'll let that bake, right, for 2 weeks at the shortest period of time. It depends, obviously, like many things in security, it depends. Sometimes up to a month. But we are very, we want to make sure that our cluster is going down as few times as possible. And we would like to have, as authoritative of a record of traffic entering and exiting the center as possible. Imagine that. So uptime is pretty important for us. We do want to make sure that no new feature is going to, cause out of memory or memory, exhaustion issues, further on down the line than immediately. We also perform, OS and other software package updates on a monthly basis. That does get done more often if a CVE dictates it. Documentation is something that I will very, very much call out as important. This is an industry problem, it seems, but nobody has time for documentation, right? Take the time to document. All of this is so much easier to digest if you take the time to explain it in the context that it's being used in your organization. I hate seeing people come away from things thinking that it's complicated when it's really not. Someone just did a bad job of explaining it to you. Yeah, that's so charge to everyone here. Let's all be better about that. I am not immune to this either, by all means. We do have some light CI/CD checks as well that happen in our GitLab. Again, nothing really amazing to write home about there. I do encourage folks to automate deployment when and where possible. Again, that's just more of an industry standard, right? Health checks, very important as well. Make sure that you are not dropping packets, and that could be in a variety of areas, right? Generally, nowadays, capture loss.log is great at telling you that it's happening, but figuring out where it's happening can be a little bit of a challenge. So for each of the components of your monitoring architecture, if you're building your own, just make sure you understand how to check each of those things for, is everything processing as it should? Are there any oddities going on? Because all too often, folks will check in one area and, think, things are fine, and just not think to look in all the places. Work is never done, right? This is a setup that was inherited and that I am happy to report that I have made some marked improvements on, but I don't know if the work will ever be done. Short list of things that, I've kind of got on my hot list. Third-party threat intel is something very interesting, but again, recall what our mission is, right? Open science. So I like to think of that in computer security terms as innocent until proven guilty. Said otherwise, I really got to trust you if you're telling me that someone's a jerk, because that's, again, researchers do weird stuff too, right? So what some people consider malicious behavior, that's just a Tuesday to research computing, which is mostly a joke. But ScanNG, again, is something I alluded to. Hopefully a couple people in here or a couple folks that are watching this, later maybe, aren't familiar with ScanNG and are now, sort of looking at that like, whoa, it's way more heavyweight than Bro Simple scans. So again, don't deploy with caution, test first. But it is super cool, and I am hoping to contribute some updates to that code to make things a little easier to understand for newcomers to that code base. I do want to release some documentation on how NERSC is doing stuff with fluentd in case anyone else wants to put a little SIEM on a stick. There is a 2015 paper that LBNL wrote on its intrusion detection at 100 gig. It is an often referenced paper, and it's almost 10 years old. I would very much like to re-examine the assumptions that are, or not assumptions, but the the statements made in that paper and see if they still hold true, right? When that paper was made, we didn't have these, weird modern CPUs with, performance cores and efficiency cores. I've certainly got my bets on how one set of those cores works with relation to making Zeek happy. But again, hypothesis needs to be made and tested. And, above all else, I do hope to continue contributing to the Zeek community. And occasionally I get to chime in, in the Slack with some question or I guess in response to a question someone has asked. And hopefully y'all have seen me asking questions myself, right? Community is a give and take thing. So, yeah, that is the sort of torrent of thought from me. And I didn't see anything in the chat, so I've stunned everyone into silence, or perhaps everyone is taking many, many notes and is ready. So let me tie up the blindfold. I'm stood up against the pole. Fire away, folks. If we've got any questions, I'll pass it back to Fatima.
All right. Thank you so much, Aaron, for this amazing talk, and really appreciate it. And I think there are not any questions. Oh, there is one question in Q&A. So the question is from Eric, and he is asking, have you considered any SSL decryption for better visibility in the SSL TLS flows?
Excellent question. Yes, but, right? You probably could have guessed that. I won't go into specific politics and reasons, like internal politics and reasons why, but I guess suffice to say, much like universities, when universities tend to have this discussion, there is an air of privacy that is, sort of rested upon. That's kind of where we're at. Again, that's where we're at the moment. That is something that we need to talk more about, right? This is not the first or last time this question will be asked, right? So not currently, but maybe someday.
Thank you. I guess I'll just give a couple more minutes for people who, if they're typing in a question or not. Okay, cool. So let's see.
I'll also say, feel free to ping me, in Slack later if I completely understand not wanting to put yourself up on the stand or anything like that. So yeah, by all means, I am self-admitted security dork. You'll find me online at all sorts of times, day and night. So hit me up anytime, y'all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron, once again. And I think we don't have any further questions. And definitely we will follow up with you on Slack if we have any further questions, or just like having a cool discussion about how you guys are working with Zeek and whatnot, and what kind of detection scripts you have. With that, thank you so much again for being a presenter today and giving this amazing presentation to our audience. With that, I have two more announcements before we wrap up this webinar. The first one is we are going to have a 2-day in-person conference in a 2-day in-person event in Germany, Munich, and that will be hosted by Zeek. Robin and other developers will be there. The dates are 27th and 26th Feb. So if you guys are in the area, and if you guys want to just take a quick flight from here to Munich, please do so. It is going to be a fun event. And other than that, one more announcement that our next webinar is on 13th of November, which is 1 week from now, again, the same time at 10 a.m. And the next speaker will be Brian Olson from Meta, and he will be talking about what's in the name hiding in plain sight. So it will be about DNS detections and whatnot using Zeek. So I think with that, we are pretty much done. Unless people have any question, we can get back at least 19 minutes of this hour. And thanks again, Aaron. Appreciate it.